Good afternoon here in Europe, good morning in the United States, and a very good evening to our folks in Australia that I know are visiting with us today. My name is Marc Garlasco.
I'm Marco Grandi.
And we are the military advisors at PAX. I want to welcome you all to the final presentation on day 2 of the PAX Protection of Civilians Conference. Today's panel is titled Accountability and Afghanistan. What now? We're very lucky to be joined by 3 esteemed panelists we'll be introducing soon. But first I want to turn it to Marco to introduce our housekeeping rules.
Thank you, Marc. I'll try to be succinct. So as you probably know, this session will be recorded and will be rendered public. You can access it at www.protectionofcivilians.org. We really strongly recommend and encourage you to engage in the discussion, pose questions. You can do that via the Slido module, or you can do that on the Q&A function on the interactive session, on the tab. We also would like to take the advantage, would like to promote the opportunity for you to take advantage of the networking opportunities that we've rendered possible through the Meet and Connect tab. We also have additional content available for you in the resource library. It's been subdivided on the basis of content and the sessions that we've discussed today, yesterday, and that we will discuss tomorrow. We'd also like to promote your promotion of our event. So if you are active on social media, please do mention our event through hashtag PAX PoC 2021 and the tag @PAX PoC or @PAX for Peace. Also, if you have any technical issues, feel free to reach out to the team. You can do that at poc@paxforpeace.nl. Over to you, Marc.
Thanks very much, Marco. So Afghanistan has a very complex history when we look at the issue of accountability. We're talking about a country which has numerous actors, international forces, the Afghan government forces, anti-government forces such as the Taliban, criminal elements, a whole host of forces that come together. And looking at accountability, we see a long history of warlords and warlordism, and also having actual war criminals in the government of Afghanistan. I was at UNAMA in 2011, and it was very difficult when we were trying to do transitional justice work, and we had to deal with individuals in the government that were actually being investigated for war crimes. That is the past look at Afghanistan and their very complex history. I'm going to turn it now to Marco to kind of take us to the present.
So if you're joining us here today, like me and many others, you probably watched the tragic events unfold this August in Afghanistan as multiple military contingents attempted to conduct a non-combatant evacuation. As you probably noticed, the mission concluded rather tragically with the death of 13 US service personnel and approximately 170 civilians at the Abbey Gate. And the whole operation culminated with a tragic strike that took the lives of further 10 Afghans. As Marc has already pointed out, accountability, even during the peak of international presence in Afghanistan, was challenging to say the least. So what does that accountability look like now when the connection between survivors of civilian harm and some of the perpetrators is so remote and so feeble? Fortunately, we have an excellent panel here today to help us discuss these issues and hopefully find some hope, some lessons learned for the future. I'd like to begin with Fawzia Ehsani, who hails from the Ghazni province in Afghanistan. She holds a master's from the Tehran University. She has worked extensively with international actors in Afghanistan, including UNDP, prior to covering a variety of positions within the Afghan government, including the prestigious position of Deputy Minister for Transport and Civil Aviation, as well as being part of the National Reconciliation Council in July 2021. Fawzia is also an avid and staunch supporter and advocate of Afghan women's rights. I'd like to welcome you, Fawzia. Marc, if you'd like to introduce Patty.
Thank you. Our second guest is Dr. Patricia Gossman. She is the Associate Director for the Asia Division at Human Rights Watch and oversees the organization's research on Afghanistan. HRW has been extremely active, especially this week, reporting on how the Taliban has executed and disappeared more than 100 ex-officials. Now, I'm personally very pleased to welcome you today, Patty, as we worked together at HRW when I was there, and I have really great respect for your work. Marco?
I'd also like to present Dr. Eve Massingham, who has graciously and courageously decided to join us here today despite the very significant time difference. I believe it's almost 1 a.m. in Brisbane right now. Dr. Massingham is a Senior Research Fellow with the School of Law at the University of Queensland. Eve's current research focuses on the diverse ways in which the law constrains or enables autonomous functions of military platforms, systems and weapons. Eve works for has worked for the International Red Cross and Red Cross movement for 10 years, including the ICRC, and has served as an Australian Army Reserve officer. Welcome, Eve. If I may, I would like to begin with you, Fawzia. Would you be kind enough to give us some insight into the events that unfolded in August, predominantly in an Afghan perspective on how all this went down? And if you'd be so kind to touch on some of the long-lasting, reverberating effects, particularly with regards to family separation. Over to you.
Oh, thank you so much to invite me to the event. I'm happy that the part of the event today. Unfortunately, all the Afghan women has a tragic story to say to other person. Unfortunately, during the evacuation and in 15 August, I was not in Afghanistan. I was awarded as a traveling scholar in the UK, and I went to Iran for some medical checkup, and then I received an email from the British military that we want to evacuate you and your family member from Afghanistan to the UK. And I told them I'm in Iran with my mother. And if it is possible, please transfer me and my mother. Yeah, that's fine. And we highly recommend that you never shoot back to Afghanistan because of your political background. It's really dangerous. And we will transfer you from there. But finally, absolutely, they transferred just me, and my mother went, unfortunately, stuck in Iran. And and Iran also say to many Afghan people that we never extend your visa, because Afghanistan is a very safe country now, because Taliban is on the government. Like me, many other Afghan women and Afghan families separated with each other. And maybe many of you heard about their news and about the stories that how they separated. And it has really concerned me that what happened during the evacuation. But evacuation was finished and many of the family members separated with each other. But I'm really now, I want to express my concern about all Afghan women who now stayed in Afghanistan and remain there. The girls, the school are banned for the girls, and the Afghan women cannot go to work, because I know many Afghan women who was responsible for their children. They lost their husband during the civilian war. And now, unfortunately, nobody can do anything for that, because Taliban are not accountable. As maybe you heard in a few days ago, the head of Taliban, the second person in Taliban leadership, in his first speech after the collapse on 15 August, said they were only responsible for continuing war against foreign forces in Afghanistan that succeeded. He said they are not responsible for addressing ongoing severe hunger and poverty. However, they are really promised to international community and other countries that absolutely we will try and work on some law and regulation to bring the women in the work, and also back the girls to the school. But it has not happened, and I'm sure it will never happen. I'm sure, at least during the 1 or 2 years, it never happened in Afghanistan.
Fawzia, thank you very much for this insight and for the emotions that this must generate. You've also done a superb job in highlighting one of the aspects that PAX's PoC program tries to emphasize continuously, and that is, of course, the reverberating effects. It's so easy to just look at the numbers of dead and casualties and think that that's it. But you've done an excellent job in giving us a much wider view, going beyond those numbers and seeing what are the true reverberating effects on the civilian population, what are the challenges, whether it be family separation, whether it be livelihood or continued education. So I appreciate you bringing this aspect a little bit closer to our world. Marc, can I hand it over to you?
Yeah, thanks very much. I appreciate it. I'd like to turn now to Patty. Patty, we've had a really amazing day here today talking about accountability. We've gone from accountability in Iraq, in which there was an airstrike by the Dutch government in Hawija, and for many years the Dutch hid this from the population and are only now coming to terms with it. We then transitioned to looking at some positive aspects of militaries dealing with accountability, looking at Afghanistan under ISAF and some of the more positive policies that they had, even though there were challenges. And then we transitioned to Africa Command, and we looked at some of the positive aspects that they have brought forward, some really new cutting-edge ways that they're dealing with it. Looking, however, at Afghanistan, we see many challenges, and I'm hoping that you can bring us kind of an insight into the challenges faced in Afghanistan, not only as we move forward, but also dealing with past issues of accountability.
Sure. Thanks very much, Marc. I think accountability, the lack of accountability, and what we might say impunity, has been really one of those defining characteristics of the war. I'd like to just mention an anecdote that occurred to me when I was preparing for what I would say. As the Taliban were moving across Afghanistan in the summer before they took Kabul in August, there were a lot of reports of people fleeing northern provinces, a kind of swelling number of internally displaced families as the Taliban took the cities of Kunduz and Takhar and other places in the north. And there was an interview in international media with a woman who was desperate. She was there with her small children, her grandchildren, I think, and with remaining members of her family. But her husband had been killed in the fight with the Taliban, and her sons had been killed in an airstrike by the Afghan Air Force. And she had nothing left, no home, very few belongings, was impoverished, and ended up in a camp in Kabul, and God only knows where she is now. But the problem with accountability in Afghanistan is it pertains to every force that has been fighting there, not just the past 20 years, which we often tend to, from our perspective, think about this war. But for Afghans, remember, it's a war that has gone on now for more than 43 years. And what happened since 2001 is just the latest phase of a war in which no party to the conflict has really been held accountable for a long laundry list of really serious war crimes and human rights violations, including massacres, torture, enforced disappearances, rape, and basically many other things you can think of. There have been some efforts at documenting these. There have been some efforts to prepare mapping reports after mapping reports that just sort of accumulate dust now on UN shelves or in databases. And in fact, what's happened is that the failure to provide any justice for these years of crimes has fueled the next cycle. In some ways, 2001 began with revenge, the US intervention for what happened on 9/11. It was followed by a lot of atrocities that are forgotten now, but were committed by troops that the US partnered with, who took revenge on people they accused of supporting the Taliban in the past. And now we're seeing the Taliban committing atrocities against those they accuse of working with US and other international forces since 2001. We know from previous, I know your session that preceded this one talked a lot about how the failure to provide accountability for airstrikes also fueled grievances that allowed the Taliban to to recruit. This is true, and it continued even after. I mean, I myself experienced trying to raise these concerns about airstrikes with resolute support in Kabul. Often these were also carried out, though, by the U.S. separate mission, Enduring Freedom. And like was said previously, these were just dismissed out of hand. I was told the people reporting these were probably with the Islamic State or the Taliban. I was told that they knew which provincial officials to trust who were reporting civilian harm. They outright dismissed reports saying, oh, that's coming from a Taliban supporter. We know that guy. I mean, there was absolutely no interest in actually hearing from people on the ground, as you've already discussed. And more so, what I found even worse, trying to talk to Afghan government officials about what were then rising civilian casualties by the Afghan Air Force. We know of incidents where madrasas were bombed. We know even as late as June of this year, terrible helicopter gunship attacks on civilians in the south, particularly in Helmand. And again, I spoke then with someone who, off the record in the National Security Council in Kabul, told me that the way an investigation was carried out was that some people would go from Kabul, meet with their partner, whatever forces on the ground, say in Helmand, agree on what had happened based simply on that, whatever that official report was, and then go all have lunch, because there was no need to actually investigate everything. There was an assumption, and this has pervaded the conflict, of guilt by association. If you're living in some part of the country where the fight was ongoing, if you lived in the wrong part of town or the wrong village, then you were essentially guilty and targetable because of who and where you were. Unfortunately, again, I say the Taliban are committing this same error. Recent reports, including from the report we just did, which was probably a fraction of the total of revenge killings that have occurred since August. But we're increasingly hearing more reports of these kinds of killings against forces or civilians the Taliban accuse of being with the Islamic State. And again, we're already hearing that this is stirring up grievances in communities who feel they are being targeted simply because they may be Salafists or they may have tribal affiliations with people the Taliban consider to be enemies. This can only fuel the next cycle. The Taliban, unfortunately, are said to us, and I think they've said publicly, they have a commission to hold people accountable. But so far, that hasn't really amounted to very much because they are not willing to cross their own commanders. They'd rather shield them, rather deny that such abuses are taking place. This is an old story, a 40-year plus story in Afghanistan, and I'm afraid it doesn't bode well for the future. I'll leave it there for now. Happy for questions.
Thanks, Patty. Yeah, and I want to come back to you on that. You opened up that issue of looking to the future. And I want to ask, what kind of institutions can we turn to for accountability? Is there an opportunity with the ICC, for example? And what are the implications of the ICC's recent decision not to look at any kind of violations by the United States?
Well, I think that's starting with the ICC. I think that is a terrible and extremely disappointing decision. It really points to selectivity in looking at these abuses and possible war crimes going back so many years. And I think it sends exactly the wrong message to those who've experienced all this, the victims of these past 20 years, at least in Afghanistan, that, only certain people's suffering really counts. And other people, the same abuses that actually fueled Taliban recruitment are going to be ignored. I mean, that sends really the wrong message and actually plays into Taliban's propaganda that they are actually the representatives of those who suffered in the war that haven't gotten justice elsewhere.
Thank you. Marco?
Eve, I'd like to turn to you now. As you are unquestionably aware, and perhaps most of our viewers are as well, the Australian Defence Force, the ADF, has been rocked by allegations of potential war crimes committed on behalf of their elite Special Forces unit, particularly in and around the period of 2011. I understand that most recently an investigation has been conducted, and I was wondering if you could give us a brief overview on the findings of the investigation. and hopefully help us identify some lessons or some potential ways that the Australians are currently looking at these challenges, and if we can extract those and maybe apply them to future conflicts. Over to you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be involved today. I'm joining you from the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people, who are the custodians of the lands that you know as Brisbane, Australia. I'm privileged to live and work on these lands, and by participating in recognising this oldest of continuing cultures, I pay my respects to their elders past and present. So yes, as Marco mentioned, the Australian investigation into war crimes in Afghanistan between the period of 2005 and 2016, but particularly around that 2011 period, has been the subject of an inquiry known here in Australia as the Brereton Inquiry. This is a very redacted document in terms of a public report that we have, but it specifically identifies 19 soldiers and 23 instances which resulted in the killing of 39 civilians and the cruel treatment of 2 others during Australian Special Forces operations in Afghanistan during that time. And that report, which came out almost exactly a year ago, so in November 2020, following some 4 to 5 years of investigatory processes, does recommend prosecutions. And so an Office of Special Investigator has been appointed to address these criminal matters. We quite recently, last month, received an update on that from the Office of the Special Investigator, noting that 12 months on, the Office is continuing to collect evidence of potential war crimes in relation to all of those 19 individuals. Nobody has yet been exonerated. So that process is still an ongoing process. And it's one that is very significant in the Australian context. Australia has not previously punished people for war crimes. There have been some attempts by the Australian legal system to do this, some failed attempts in the 1980s in relation to World War II war crimes by people who had subsequently become Australian citizens. And also some sort of slightly odd legal processes in relation to other events that Australian forces had been involved in, but none of these charges have seen the whole process through. So it's a very significant development from an Australian approach to dealing with war crimes. And, you know, as an Australian citizen and as someone who has some military experience, I think it's an incredibly important process. Australia are state parties to the International Criminal Court, and the promise that the Australian government effectively made to Australians and to Australian service personnel is that if these types of events happen, then Australia will do what is required to investigate and prosecute where appropriate. And that will be done domestically, and Australians won't go before the International Criminal Court because Australia will deal with that process. So I think it's a really important process that's going to happen and is happening, but we don't really know exactly what that's going to look like. There are, as you can imagine, and of course, as recent events have perhaps made even more tricky, huge evidentiary problems. Giving testimony in these sorts of cases is incredibly challenging. So it's a really big job, but a very important one that the Office of the Special Investigator now has to take this process forward and to consider these issues. However, I think what we can say in terms of lessons learned and contributions that perhaps this Australian investigation is making to the global discourse around this is to look at the fact that it can't just be about prosecutions. The prosecutions are so important. It's a really important part of it. But that is only one component of accountability. And so, as you alluded to, what are the things that are happening in the Australian context? Well, there is a whole range of measures that are being taken. And look, the jury is still out on a lot of these things. I'm not saying that there's any clear answers yet, or by any means suggesting that there's any massive cultural change that has just happened overnight. But there have been a number of aspects to the Brereton report recommending changes in the culture. An independent panel of experts has been appointed, which is providing oversight around the broader response to the inquiry. So not just the prosecutions bit, in relation to cultural, organisational and leadership change. Now, some of the changes around governance and culture did predate the report. Some of these have been ongoing because there have been knowledge of concerns for some years. But the recommendations of the inquiry include looking at things like the rotations and the science around appropriate operational deployment rotations. The practice of the Australian military has been to use the Special Forces as the default sort of first force of first choice, and it's been acknowledged that absolutely needs to have been abandoned. In September, so just a couple of months ago, the Australian Defence Force released a doctrine on ethics. I think that's probably quite surprising news, because I think a lot of us would have assumed that document already existed well before September 2021, and that the impact of that is, of course, yet to be seen. A number of recommendations around the promotion of those people who stood up and said that this conduct is not okay. And there's obviously been a significant number of people who have been dishonourably discharged from the forces. And there are a number of recommendations around acknowledging the need for secrecy in respect of operational matters, not extending to criminal conduct, and making these sorts of things really clear. So, these are not perfect answers by any means. There is obviously some horribly distressing conduct that has taken place, and it will take many years, I am sure, to go through a prosecutorial process and to have the evidence collected and the testimony given. But there are measures in addition to that prosecutorial process that are taking place and play an important contributing role. There is also, I'll just finally mention the compensation aspect. And so a key recommendation of the report was that there be redress to the families of the victims, and that take place without waiting for the prosecutions to conclude, acknowledging that may be a very lengthy process. There was an intention that compensation plan would be out by the end of this year. It's not out as yet. My last check a few hours ago, but there will be a compensation component to the Australian response. So certainly not, horrific reading in the Brereton report on horrific events that took place, and certainly not an all-encompassing solution. But it does seem to be, and certainly still lots of questions. I mean, there's a big concern in Australia that this inquiry has gone after the more junior people, and that people in senior leadership positions during this time are still serving, and some of them in very senior leadership positions. So not in any way a perfect solution, but I'm not sure you'll ever have that in terms of accountability. But arguably some steps towards some reckoning for this conduct.
Eve, thank you for that. There are so many questions. It's hard to really zero in on just one or two. Perhaps one to try and seek some really tangible takeaways from this. For example, I know the process is still in its infancy, despite the fact that these allegations first surfaced in 2016. And I know it's all untested terrain, but would you be able to give any insight into what that legal process could potentially look like? You mentioned the challenges with capturing evidence from the field, for example. But I was also under the understanding that even during the investigation process, there could be potential errors that were committed because some witnesses were not able to exercise their right to not self-incriminate, so the testimony may not be used then in the formal investigation for the trial. So that would be my first question. And the other one, is there any discussion as to what amends might actually look like in the form of delivery, particularly in the very challenging context now, considering who's running the country officially? How do we ensure that those amends get to who really needs them and who should be receiving them? Over to you, if you could.
So I'm definitely not a domestic Australian criminal law expert, but I do know, as everyone does know, that the answer to, I guess, your first question really isn't fully known yet. There's a lot of questions about how this is actually going to happen. As I mentioned, there was a little bit of experience in Australia in the 1980s with prosecuting international crimes. And those prosecutions were unsuccessful, but it did actually result in Australians having a little bit of experience in evidentiary collection in relation to mass atrocity crimes. And so there has in the past sort of been some Australian experience in this. But I think that the collection of evidence and the ability to afford natural justice in this process, both to those who are accused and those who are the families of the victims is going to be incredibly difficult. I mean, we look at how hard it is in the International Criminal Court and tribunals of a similar nature, and that is, in some of those cases, that is in a situation where there is cooperation and an ability for investigators to visit and engage in country, and obviously the events of August 2021 have changed that significantly. So even since the Brereton report came out and the Office of the Special Investigator was established, these things have got even harder. But questions around evidence and national security are things that are already taking place in Australia for other trial reasons. And I think that's going to come up a lot in the prosecutorial process going forward. But even questions as to, should this be dealt with in a military justice setting or in a civilian criminal context, and exactly what these trials might look like are still quite unanswered in the Australian context. And I think, as was identified by the Brereton report, saying we need to deal with this compensation issue much sooner, there's an acknowledgement that these are going to be lengthy processes. As we say, there's the investigation itself, was a long process. The Office of the Special Investigator has been going for some months now, and we don't really know what it's going to look like. So it is going to be a lengthy process, and there are going to be significant evidentiary challenges with both the evidence that has been provided for the purpose of the investigation and whether it can be used, and also with collecting evidence and giving the victims' families the opportunity to be heard in the proceedings.
Thank you for that, Eve. Marc?
Well, I'd like to thank our guests for the opening statements, and we're now going to turn to a broader question and answer session. We've got a number of questions for you. The audience is welcome to participate. If anyone here in the audience would like to stand up and ask a question, I welcome you. We've got a number of questions up on the board already. And any of those in the virtual audience that would like to continue to provide questions, we welcome that. I'd like to turn now to Fawzia. Fawzia, I'd like to ask you, how has this lack of accountability that Patty spoke about for the past crimes in Afghanistan affected the people of Afghanistan?
Unfortunately, we never witnessed some accountability, at least in the Taliban regime. I want to beginning with my experience as former deputy minister in Afghanistan. Firstly, I should mention here that I don't want to defend the previous government performance. Just I want to compare the accountability in Republic with Taliban regime. Actually, before the fall of Kabul into the hands of Taliban, the government had to report constantly mechanisms put in place by Afghan laws and Afghanistan commitment with international community. We had the Afghan parliament, we had the freedom of speech that all of them forced the government to be accountable. Vibrant civil society acted as watchdog on implementation of big projects, important decisions, every activity of the government. Donor and international community also hold the Afghan government accountable for its daily tasks. Our engagement with international community and their active presence in Afghan made it possible. And also political parties as diverse actors also pressured the government to be accountable for its appointment, inclusiveness, and responsive. I think Taliban will never be accountable for their crimes. Because, for instance, Taliban didn't adhere to their commitment at first days. They banned girls for a school, stopped women working in out of home despite declaring amnesty. They reported killed and tortured many Afghans who worked for previous government. We witnessed it in these days. Many Afghan people killed just because of they were part of the military or part of the government. And according to Human Rights Watch reported release on 13 November, many Afghans were killed or disappeared. Early this month was a deadly month for this civil society activists too. Fawzia Safi, a right activist, Balkh province, and civil society activist Navid in Helmand was killed for criticizing continued delays in teachers' salaries in his Facebook page. Actually, Taliban demolished all channels that could hold them accountable. For instance, Afghanistan parliament is closed. It has turned into a military reshuffling and reform commission. MPs used to be a strong criticized of executive in the past. Afghan media continued to sustain heavy losses. According to NAI, Afghanistan Independent Media Defense Organization, in past 100 days under Taliban, more than 250 newspaper, radio, and TV stations have closed in first 100 days of militants' rule. It gives them opportunity to escape accountability. In addition to it, in September, Taliban issued new regulation to media. It's meant when they are banned and bring some restriction for the media, absolutely, it shows they don't want to be accountable, at least for the media. And a member of the Taliban leadership said in September that they are going to enforce Afghanistan's last royal era constitution, aside from those articles which do not align with the Islamic faith. This constitution, which was applicable from 1964 to, I think, 1973, I think, the country's last King Zahir Shah was not accountable to the people and the parliament, just like the Taliban supreme leader isn't now. In addition, the law of the political parties was ignored. It also undermines their intent of forming broad-based inclusive government with women in ministerial position, even in the junior position. In addition to the lack of Afghanistan engagement with international community in these days, as well as presence of political parties inside Afghanistan, help Taliban erode transparency and accountability. In the past, different mutual commitments forced the Afghan government to be accountable for their efforts in supporting inclusive economic growth, poverty reduction, job creation, and many other things, and also human rights, women empowerment. Unfortunately, today, these tools are no longer functional in Taliban in power. As also we witnessed it in yesterday, Iran was one of the main supporters of the Taliban, but we witnessed a conflict between them in the Nimruz border, and it's meant they are not accountable to anyone, even their supporter. We witnessed that. Personally, I thought every time that Iran really is a very good supporter, and absolutely Taliban try to deal with the Iran government. But now we witness that they even are not accountable to or responsible against their action and performances in Afghanistan. That's why I think, no, it is not possible that the Taliban be accountable for their activity and their crimes that did it in the past.
Thanks, Fawzia. I appreciate that. And I'd like to follow up on that with something that Patty brought up earlier. So she spoke about how the actions of the coalition forces and the lack of accountability for whatever crimes they may have been have committed really emboldened and empowered the Taliban. And I'm wondering from your perspective, how important is it to look at the things that the coalition forces did during their time there? Things such as night raids, civilian casualties from airstrikes, torture of prisoners in detention, those kinds of issues.
Well, actually, I don't want to speak many times and two things about this because actually I don't have enough information about that. But I think all of them try to be at least accountable to the Afghan people, because many Afghan people are effect on the civilian war in Afghanistan, and even during the international community presence in Afghanistan. And actually, I don't want to really speak many times about this because I don't want to say something that it is not correct or something like this.
Thank you, Fawzia. I appreciate it. Let me turn it to you, Marco.
Thanks, Marc. Patty, I'd like to direct this question to you from our virtual participants. As noted in the last session, it is often incumbent on civilians, survivors, to seek recourse themselves. How can we improve, make this process easier in the future? Over to you.
Well, that's indeed very important. I mean, from my experience on the ground, it was extraordinarily difficult for civilians of any kind of victims of any kind of particular violence to seek remedies, to seek any compensation, even to have their situation acknowledged. I mean, I think this came up in the last session, but as I said, have interviewed people on the ground who, first of all, didn't know exactly where they should go to. They may be in far rural areas. They knew, they'd been hit in an airstrike and their families destroyed or houses destroyed. And it wasn't easy. Often would report to the local authorities, but as I mentioned, these were often dismissed when it came to the civilian casualty team under Resolute Support, or would say that this was really, under Operations of Enduring Freedom, wasn't something they could answer to. I think when it came to Afghan government operations, it was equally hard. And the fear was always that in the kind of very divided way that the war played out, which has made it very complicated for people to see that they get acknowledgement for what has happened. Any attempt to bring up something that happened to your family, you risk being dismissed as being a supporter of the enemy. And I think that continues today. Right now, we see that people cannot report. The report we just issued was very difficult to research because people didn't want to reveal too much about what had happened to their relatives for fear that that would then make them targetable, that would kind of reveal their identities, where they were, that they were in fact complaining about some Taliban operation. This has been a continuing feature of the wars. There needs to be a monitoring, there needs to continue to be more monitoring on the ground, some neutral authorities that civilians can go to. One thing we've been pushing for is for UNAMA to continue to play that role in Afghanistan. At the moment, it's very unclear because of the kind of politics around the UN's continuing role as the Taliban in power. I'd say that the complexities aren't just from the Taliban on this, but from other members of the Security Council. So whether in fact there will be any kind of institution that people can turn to looks kind of doubtful at the moment, but it is very much needed. I'd like to second what Fawzia said too about the media. In some ways, that media can sometimes perform that role. We've seen it with respect to US airstrikes recently, with the New York Times and others reporting, and certainly in Afghanistan, even though they operated under some constraint, even under the previous government, it still was a way to provide some spotlight on abuses. Certainly some of the cases I became aware of were first reported by Afghan media, even in rural areas. We don't seem to have that possibility at the moment. And other mechanisms that did exist for the moment are gone. So unless there is support for some kind of reporting mechanism from going forward, it will be very hard for people to feel they have any voice or any means to be heard about the things that are going on in their community and to their families.
If I could just add to that, do you think that with the access to technology, to an interconnected world, that perhaps that could provide a part of the solution, still protecting the identity of who captures information and passes it on through computerized networked channels, that there's those local voices can then be amplified beyond the control of the national regime in this case?
To some extent. I mean, in the months since the Taliban took Kabul, there's been a flood of reports on social media. I'm inundated with such reports, but verifying them is extremely difficult. And there's, of course, great incentive for people to create reports too. So you have to be very sure. When it was, again, recent our report took a while because you really have to verify accounts. And that's always the case, not just when the Taliban are in power, but under the previous government as well. But that aside, the fact that there is now this, which didn't exist previously in the many previous decades of the war, there's this possibility for people to report on things, to film them, to pass on photos. It's very hard to completely hide an atrocity. And I think the Taliban are also aware of this. I think they were taken aback, maybe as some of the reports very quickly came out. Whether that will continue also may depend on the economic situation. People have expressed great concern to me that if the internet, people can't afford it anymore, because right now people are, poverty is rising steeply in Afghanistan. Or if the telecom companies themselves aren't paid, will there be more internet shutdowns in the country? It will be more difficult for people to communicate. So all that we don't know, that it is a lifeline at the moment for many people.
Thank you, Patty.
I'd like to turn now to Eve. Eve, when I take a look at accountability for some of the crimes in Afghanistan, I'm really struck that the only two countries that we're seeing taking real action are Australia and New Zealand in the two investigations that they've both conducted. And I'm curious what your perspective is on what lessons other countries can draw from the experience of Australia and New Zealand in particular. I'm looking right now at my country, the United States, and there's been this incident, the Barghouth strike, which right now is under investigation in the Pentagon, and it's in the media. And there's been a call now for congressional oversight of airstrikes and other actions by the U.S. military. And so I'm wondering, as the United States looks towards having some kind of accountability for its acts, what lessons can we take from your experience?
I mean, I think if you look at the different responses to war crimes over, really now the last 30 years, we've seen the ad hoc international tribunals, we've seen some hybrid processes, we've seen some domestic processes, some supported by sort of international actors. We have seen in obviously the Australian and New Zealand investigations that you mentioned recently and recommendations. And we've also seen truth and reconciliation commissions in a number of different countries. So I think, there are lots of different ways of the international community trying to deal with war crimes. I feel like the lesson that we've learned from these 30 years is that we're probably never going to get it right, but that efforts towards improving the chances of justice have been seeing some positive outcomes that have come about. I think a really clear aspect of accountability is that you cannot have accountability without a clear narrative of what has happened. And this goes to the conversation, that Patty was just having around sort of getting the evidence and knowing what's actually happening. And so, the focus on the truth and reconciliation approach in some contexts historically has been really important. And it is a clear part of the recommendations from the Brereton report that you actually catalogue and give people the chance to share that narrative. And, I appreciate that is definitely not a perfect solution, and it doesn't bring back the family members who have been lost to these war crimes and to these horrendous actions. But it does seem that a clear lesson from 30 years of very ad hoc attempts by the international community to bring about some accountability for war crimes is that this narrative and recording and accurately recording what's actually happened is a really important part of the process. And as you were just talking about as well, this idea of having to prove the harm that was done to you. I mean, that's a bit of an inherent feature of legal systems. Unfortunately, the fact that the people who are particularly vulnerable and have particular challenges are often going to have to prove that this actually happened to me because of the process of giving the accused their natural rights. So, I mean, I think the conversations about people raising these stories, and absolutely commend all the wonderful actors who are doing all this work to support Afghans in these challenging times to tell these stories. But I feel like that is actually a really important part of it. You cannot have accountability without a clear narrative.
Thanks very much. I appreciate that. And so unfortunately, we've only got about 10 minutes left. What I'd like to do is throw it back to our panelists and one at a time give you an opportunity to provide us with maybe a 3-minute reflection on accountability for Afghanistan and what the future could mean as far as that goes. And I'd like to hit Fawzia first, please.
Oh, thank you. I think Taliban should know that people want to be connected to their work. And many people need work and job. And I think it is not good respond to the people that we are not responsible for the hunger and poverty. I mean, government is not something like that. A country has some ministers and deputy ministers and some things like that. People really need the work, need the job, need need food. And to the international community, they need to engage they need also engage to international community events. And we are seeing that some international events are taking place without the presence in Afghanistan. International community should force Taliban to engage with them, respect human rights, women rights, and all girls should back to school. It is very important. I want to share some personal story. I lost my father when I didn't born, and my mother was responsible for me and for my elder sister. And my sister was the first girl who went to university, and I was the first girl in our family, in whole my relatives and family, who take the master's degree. It is because of my mother. My mother was not educated in Afghanistan, but when she migrated to Iran, she tried to start to be literate. And that's why she now is a modern woman. She has the Instagram account. She is active in the social media, and she really pushes us. It's meant that a woman, how a woman can children grow up their children as an educated and effective in society. That's why I really want to emphasize on that international community should force the Taliban to open the school for the girls. And also Taliban should deliver services to Afghan people. They also should, freedom of media and civil society should be supported by international community. And it can be watchdog on Taliban's everyday work and pressure them for right decision. Yeah, something like this. It is my opinion that the international community is really effective, and they can force Taliban to be responsible and accountable about their action and performance in the Afghanistan community.
Thanks very much, Fawzia. I want to turn now to Patty. Patty, we've got about 5 minutes left. Can you give us your closing thoughts on accountability for Afghanistan? And if possible, could you touch on the international forces?
Yes, I'd like to just say that one of the problems with the way that we've looked at accountability in Afghanistan over these past 20 years is a lot of focus has been on things like training or, Afghanistan was drafting laws, some of the things Fawzia mentioned earlier on, creating bodies that were meant to address this issue. But without accountability, all the training, all the mentoring that took place was meaningless, because in the end, if there is no accountability, if there's no price to be paid, if no one really cares in the end about what happened to people on the ground, then the training doesn't really matter. And I think also the fact that at a level which any of the forces would have been aware that their mentors were also responsible for crimes for which they were never held accountable. So all the messages that were sent about what an accountable force should look like, about democracy, about respect for the civilian, avoiding civilian harm and the rest, it doesn't mean anything if in the end there isn't any accountability. And just very briefly, you say that one of the experiences I had working on the conflict mapping report with the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission was that there was very little awareness among people of what had happened in other parts of the country other than their own through many years of war. And I think accountability also includes that acknowledgement beyond the selectivity. Again, that gets back to what we saw with the ICC, a selective approach and the absence of real accountability can only fuel more revenge and fuel more conflict.
Thanks very much, Patty. I greatly appreciate it. Eve, last word to you. We've got about 2 minutes left. If you could close us out here.
I guess my answer to the question is, what's accountability going to look like? Is it's going to be piecemeal, and it's going to be very far from perfect. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't just keep pursuing the different avenues. So, I think the international approach, as well as individual states looking into their conduct, and absolutely they've placed. I totally agree with Patty. Everyone's placed so much emphasis on training and how important all of this is around making the mentors train people, and absolutely, if the mentors aren't looking into their own conduct, that's really problematic. So I think accountability is totally agree with my colleagues on the panel that it's not going to be met in lots of quarters. But sort of as an international community, if we were having this conversation, well, we just wouldn't have been having this conversation 30 years ago. So there has been some move towards having accountability for international crimes, but we are a long, long way from achieving that. And so, I guess just sort of within what is possible, certainly ensuring that people are empowered to share the narrative and to make it clear what actually took place will be an important part of that accountability.
Hey, thanks for giving us a positive note to end on. And I want to turn it over to Marco now to close us out for the day.
Thank you, Marc. Once again, thank you to all our speakers, particularly those that stayed up to almost 2 a.m. And thank you also to all our participants here who have been supporting us. And I really regret that we weren't able to answer all those questions. Please feel free to reach out to the speakers or to ourselves, and we'll do our best to get back to you on that. Thank you again. Do join us tomorrow. We have a really interesting agenda. We'll be looking at the future conflicts, champions of PoC within international organizations, and resilience and the connection with PoC, as well as some other topics. Thank you again for joining us.
And we're going to go now to Wilbert to close us out for the day.
All right. Thanks, Marc and Marco, for handing it over to me to give me a chance to close off the day. And what a rich day. It's like sitting where I sit. I started here in this chair this morning, and I'm sitting here now again. I'm exhausted, but also exhilarated, and I feel extremely richer in what I know about this topic and what I've learned today. With the session starting on Awija with the mayor and others, but also then talking about examples of missions struggling with the concept of accountability. And now this final session, really wonderful on Afghanistan as well. This morning when I opened the day, I said that last year we talked for a whole day on civilian harm, and that, for example, led to a whole book. So I'm looking at my colleagues. I think we should write a book about accountability now. They agree, I think, for people at home. But yeah, this was incredibly enriching, and will certainly help us in our work in the coming year, and I hope so for others too. I want to thank the incredible team that we have at PAX for this wonderful day as well. First of all, all those of you who were facilitating sessions today, incredible, with Saba and Erin and Marc and Marco and others. But also all the people in our team who have been working behind the scenes that you don't see at home, but people at least here in the room can see them work, moderating sessions, but also all the other stuff that's happening, of course, on the technical side and in organizing a conference day like this. Let us know what you thought of this session, but also of the day. There's going to be a poll posted on Slido, I think now or at least after this session. But also in other ways, feel free to reach out to us, the sweet and the sour. If there's something that you didn't like or that you felt offended by, for example, please let us know as well. Tomorrow is our final day for the conference. We will start at 1:30. With an address by Mr. Admiral Stavridis, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, and he will share his lessons learned on PoC for the future of warfare. This will be followed by an expert panel on connecting realities to champion PoC, with contributions from Chad, Iraq, and the Netherlands. And we will close off the day tomorrow, but also the conference, with 2 parallel sessions. One is an open session on the connection between resilience and PoC. If you liked Marco today as a facilitator, he's going to be a presenter tomorrow, so be sure to tune in to that session. And the other one is an invitation-only session on championing PoC in international organizations. The final thing I want to say is thank you to all the speakers and all the other contributors today to all the sessions, including those who dared to stand up and ask questions here in the room. I wish you a very pleasant evening and hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you.